Alright students, welcome to chapter 15. Hopefully this chapter is relatively easy as we've covered correlation coefficient before back in chapter 5, but really the point of this chapter is to walk you through the 5 steps of hypothesis testing for correlation coefficient. So here are our objectives: to just review when do we use Pearson's correlation coefficient and also Spearman's correlation coefficient. Review how to interpret SPSS output, and also review how to calculate and interpret the coefficient of determination, which is going to be your big R squared. And this is when we have significant relationships. But really, the main point of this chapter is to know how we apply the 5 steps of hypothesis testing for correlation coefficient analyses. So just a quick review. Correlation coefficient is when we're looking at the strength and direction of a linear relationship between two variables. Thus, this is called a bivariate correlation or bivariate relationship. And really, this is a function of the scores for variable x and scores for variable y. And we've seen this big formula, which we'll see in a few slides. So we use correlation coefficient when we want to examine the relationship, the association, the connectedness, the correlation, all of these synonyms between two ungrouped interval ratio variables. So we don't have grouped interval ratio variables. Even though they're interval and ratio, because they're grouped, we cannot run a correlation coefficient because they're grouped. So we only use correlation coefficient when we have ungrouped interval ratio variables. So for example, number of hours that an athlete practices and how quickly that athlete finishes the 400-yard dash. Both of these two variables, number of hours practiced, is ungrouped, as well as time to finish a 400-yard dash, ungrouped. So this is when we're going to do a Pearson's correlation coefficient. But if both of your variables are ordinal in nature, then we have to do a Spearman's correlation coefficient. So an example for that would be how prepared you'd feel from 0 to 10, where 0 is I didn't study one bit, totally not prepared, to 10, I am so prepared for this, I looked at every single word in the textbook, reviewed every single problem and the in-class exercises and the homework, and reviewed all the quizzes. I'm totally prepared. So your preparedness from a scale of 0 to 10 for the final exam. And then how happy you feel after taking the final exam. 0 is, oh man, I think I totally bombed it. I am so sad and depressed. To where a 10 is, I am so ecstatic. I'm so happy, happy, happy because I feel like I totally aced it. Right? So both of these two variables, preparedness and happiness, are both ordinal in nature. And thus we would have to conduct a Spearman's correlation coefficient. Now, if you recall back in chapter 5, we had all sorts of different types of correlation coefficients. We had biserial, point biserial. Don't worry about needing to know those for this chapter. The two you should know, though, are Pearson's correlation coefficient and Spearman's correlation coefficient. And so Spearman's and Pearson's correlation coefficient both range from -1 to +1. Remember, negative R values indicate an indirect or negative relationship. That is, one variable goes up, the other variable goes down, only indicating direction. Whereas if you have a positive R, that's indicating a direct or a positive relationship or correlation. Whereas one variable goes up, the other variable goes up. Or if one variable goes down, the other variable also goes down. So simply the sign, positive or negative, indicates direction. But the magnitude of your coefficient, of your little r, indicates the strength. And these are the 5 categories that we use to indicate the strength or the size of the correlation. When we're talking about no relationship, or weak, to moderate, to strong, to very strong. And remember, we can have a moderate direct or a moderate indirect. All right, so let's get to the nitty-gritty of this chapter. Our plan for hypothesis testing for correlation coefficient. Hopefully you know these steps by heart now. Steps 1 and steps 2, stating our hypotheses and the equations. Step 3, calculating our test statistic. In this case, our test statistic for correlation coefficient is little r. And we'll talk about and we'll go through how we do the hand calculation for little r, which we've done before in chapter 5, and then how we do it in SPSS. And then step 4, making our decision, and we'll have the tools that we'll need to make our decision and also the rule to make our decision. And then finally, step 5, stating our conclusions. All right, so here is our research question. And I'm just going to use the same one that we used in chapter 5 just to make it that much easier. So we want to know, is there a relationship between the age of first use of alcohol and the age of first use for smoking cigarettes? So go ahead and take a moment and go ahead and write out the hypotheses for step 1 and step 2. But don't write out the equations yet because it's going to be different from what we've talked about and learned thus far. So go ahead and pause the video and work through writing out your null and alternative hypotheses, but not the equation yet. All right, so let's take a look at step 1. There is no relationship between the age of first use of alcohol and the age of first use for smoking cigarettes. Okay, so now let's talk about the null hypothesis equation for correlation coefficient. Reflect on how you stated the null hypothesis equation when we were talking about t-test and ANOVA. What symbol did we use? We were using mu, right, which stood for the population mean. Well, in this case, we don't have necessarily the means that we're trying to compare. What we're really going to be looking at in terms of our equations is this, where rho of x and y equals 0. And what do you think rho stands for? Thinking of how we denote x, y, and we have a 0 here. Rho is essentially your population correlation coefficient. And we expect that our correlation coefficient for the population, which is rho, because it's a Greek symbol, recall that we use Greek symbols to refer to the population, and we use Roman symbols, such as our alphabet, to denote sample. So if we're talking about a correlation coefficient equal to 0, what does that mean? Does that mean that there is a direct or an indirect or no correlation? It means that there's no correlation, no relationship. Thus, our null hypothesis equation jives with what we said in the actual hypothesis, that there is no relationship, no correlation. So our equation for correlation coefficient for the null hypothesis is rho equals 0. Step 2. There is a relationship between the age of first use of alcohol and the age first use of smoking cigarettes. So based upon our research question and our hypothesis, we can write out a directional and also a non-directional equation. So let's just talk about stating the non-directional research hypothesis equation based upon this alternative hypothesis here. So we're simply going to write out h sub 1 is r of x and y is not equal to 0. Because we know that if r is equal to 0, that means that there is no correlation, no relationship. But we're saying that there is a relationship. We're not necessarily saying whether that's a direct or indirect relationship. We're just saying that yes, there is. So r could be greater than 0 or less than 0. Thus, r is not equal to 0. But if we were to go ahead and posit and state that we think that there is a positive or a direct relationship between alcohol and cigarette use, well, we can state that r is greater than 0. Because if r is greater than 0, then we know that that's going to indicate a direct relationship. And conversely, if we posit that there's going to be a negative relationship or an indirect relationship, we can further hypothesize with our equation that r is less than 0. So we can see with correlation coefficient, we can write out directional and non-directional research hypotheses and equations. It's just based upon the actual research question. Am I asking about specifically positive or negative or direct or indirect relationship, or are we just trying to see if there is a relationship? We're not necessarily sure in which direction. So pay attention to the research question to figure out what to write out in step 2 in terms of your research hypothesis and your research equation.